Hey kids, welcome to Conscious Embodiment, Astrology, and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. It is I, your host, Dr. Michael Lennox, coming at you with Zoe Producer for the week of July 11th through the 17th. Howdy, Zoe. How's life in your world? How's life in your United States of America?
It's okay. Pushing along.
Pushing along. Well,
Yeah.
it's an interesting moment for us here in the United States and therefore for the world, as I've talked a lot about and talked about on last week's podcast, the Pluto Return of the United States chart.
Right. That's this week, right?
Well, it's one of the days it hits and peaks is today. Monday, July 11th is one of the peak days of the three hits
Right.
that we have of this particular geometrical thing. But this is Pluto we're talking about. Like, Pluto transits should be thought of as like 3 years long. So even though it's exact this year, we can consider 2021 to be almost as much a Pluto return for the U.S. as this year is. And the same can be said about next year.
Oh, okay.
So
Got
it stands to reason that in this calendar year, when it's exact, that the intensity of what this transit is reflecting for us would be greater. And I think we're seeing that in the political landscape, that things have gotten to that place this year where people are saying, wow, maybe I didn't realize just how far down the rabbit hole we were going to go in the U.S. But here we are.
For this whole year, we're going to keep digging.
Well, yeah, we are certainly not done with the big reveal.
Okay.
I think the events of the last 5 weeks or so in politics and cultural events in the U.S. sort of hit a point of depth and intensity, and I think it's interesting that happened while the depth and intensity of the transit was building. So we're seeing right now a great deal of shadow being kicked up in the U.S. But we're certainly not done with the last hit of it, which will come at the end of the year in December, and the residual energy of it that next year will bring because of the slow movement of Pluto. So we're just really full on in something that has a bigger shelf life than just this month, though it's peaking this month. But I got asked a question that I found a little bit confronting, and I had to think a little bit about this, where someone was asking me, like, well, what do we do with this? Like, what do we do with looking at what's happening in the United States, allowing for the astrology to offer the context that helps us understand things that we're moving through? But then there's well, what do we do with this information? And I thought to myself, well, wow. I mean, I don't know that I know the answer to that without just sort of opening up my mouth and speaking into it and seeing what comes out, like what comes through me as I consider what's the value of moving through a Pluto return in a country where we are consciously aware that that's what's happening. And so what do we do with that information? I thought about, well, what's the returning planet that most people who are at least a little bit familiar with astrology understand, and that's the Saturn return. You don't tumble into learning about astrology without learning that right around 29-ish, 28, 29, or 30 years old, everybody moves through their first Saturn return. Second Saturn return happens around 58, 59, 60. We talked last week about the fact that you and I, so we're both in our Saturn returns respectively from being sort of roughly 30 years apart in age. So I'm going to speak into this for a second to sort of help understand what we might do vis-a-vis the Pluto return is, well, what do we do with the Saturn return at the personal level? Saturn is the teacher. Saturn is charged with making sure that we know enough about adulting so that when we pass through the first Saturn return, we are wise enough, adult enough, that we've learned all of the lessons that we need to function powerfully as a full-on grown-up, so that if there are lessons you need to learn as an individual that you have not learned yet successfully, the idea is that Saturn will kick all those lessons up the year of the Saturn return. To what end, right? That's the question. To what end?
Right.
Well, it's like if you're paying attention and you're operating your life in a conscious way and you're in your first Saturn return, you're going to be bumping up against the things that you need to learn to be more effective in the world because you faced the things you had to figure out at a deep and abiding level. So that when the Saturn return passes and you're beyond it, hopefully you've learned enough about how to operate differently, because the places where you were lacking, you got lots of deep, classroom time in during the Saturn return itself. So it's not like when Saturn return is over, you're no longer learning lessons about yourself. But the shift is the high stakes final exam lessons are over, and then you're charged with running your life from that place of what have you learned?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like at the end of The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy's in her Saturn return. What did you learn, Dorothy? Well, I learned this, that home is right where the heart is. So then what happens then is she's got to go back to Kansas and live that way.
Right.
She's got to live based on the lesson, and that's what each of us do in our individual Saturn returns.
And that's similar for the Pluto return.
Right, because if the Saturn return's about what do you have to learn and to upgrade your sort of level of wisdom, the Pluto return is what do you have to change in order to be successful in the consciousness that the chart is trying to express. So if the chart of the United States is attempting to express a successful, viable country based on a profound experiment of democracy, then our Pluto return is a little bit like the individual Saturn return, only it's about what needs to be revealed that we're not looking at, that will show us what needs to be changed and transformed. And during the sort of 3 peak years of this Pluto return experience, we are pulling back the covers and seeing what's in the basement. I don't think that we can see what's in the underbelly of the United States and fix and transform it at the same time.
No, there's got to be like a reckoning first.
Right. So what I think happens in the next 250 years is we have the opportunity to transform the things about the country that are not working so that we can thrive longer than this moment. That we don't have to call this the end of the experiment, but the very, very bumpy passage between the sort of youngness of our country into its middle age. Like if you live to 100 years, you're going to go through 3 Saturn returns.
Right.
So if the country lasts a millennia, if the country lasts 1,000 years, we're going to go through 3 Pluto returns. And this is just the first of that. So I'm likening this Pluto return to be similar to a human being's first Saturn return. We're still young and vibrant and youthful in our country's origin, and we're about to step into the next sort of 300 years of our maturity if we successfully navigate the deep changes and transformations that must occur that this year is revealing so profoundly. I think it's, on the one hand, a terrifying idea, but on the other hand, I really do believe we got this in consciousness, And we just all have to do our best to transform our own individual shadows so that the collective has a less shadow in its insides, and we get to create a world where the United States can thrive because it has responded to the call of what needs to be transformed. There's a deeply spiritual perspective in this full moon as well, that the Cancer archetype isn't just about self-care and, going to the spa and putting your own oxygen mask on first. It's also how we first connect to the Great Mother archetype. And then Capricorn is the Great Father archetype. So there's a real mommy-daddy thing going on with Cancer and Capricorn from a spiritual perspective, that we steep ourselves in our connection to the divine feminine at the personal level in the Cancer archetype. And then we allow then for the masculine sense of our divine connection to come in with Capricorn, where we then climb the mountain that the goat's going to get up there. The goat climbing up the mountain in Capricorn is often thought of as simply our ambitions realized, the steps we have to take to make shit happen. So the mundane sense of Capricorn is all about the goal. And that's accurate. I mean, that if we have a sign that invented goals, it is definitely Capricorn. But I like to think about, well, why is that goat climbing up the mountain in the first place? He's just climbing up the mountain to see further. To have greater vantage point. To have a conscious awareness that is so high that you can see far with it. So one of the things that we're releasing in a Capricorn full moon is aspects of self that Cancer would point us out to, that inhibit our ability to allow for a higher level of perception to take place in that Capricorn sensibility of, I climb to the top of the mountain so I can see further. Then, of course, on the other end of the spectrum with this is a very fundamental relationship with care of self in a preparatory way so that I can, in fact, climb the mountains of my ambition. So that when we marshal into our interior landscape during this week of this full moon, we want to be paying attention to, what do I have to let go of that's inhibiting my effectiveness out in the world? Cancer energy, we lift up self-care, but if you're going to also suffer from inhibition or a fear about moving out into the world, or, feeling so vulnerable that you'd rather shut the door to feel safe, then there's no life if you aren't also then climbing up the mountain outside in the world, right? So this is a moment to also let go of fears around the goals you wish to sort of line up and say, I am a stand for this. I want to create that. Sometimes the thing that keeps us from powerful effectiveness in the world in the direction of our goals is inner inhibitions, inner inabilities to take on, your own magnificence. So this Cancer Capricorn polarity is helping us balance out sort of the needs that you have in a very tiny and small way to feel safe so that you can create magnificent sort of things out in the world. In the natural wheel, Cancer rules the 4th house, which is all about home and hearth. And Capricorn rules the natural 10th house, which is all about what you do out in the world. This axis is foundational to us. Cancer's like the root chakra, 10th house is a little bit like the crown chakra, and when we put those things together, we live in our hearts, effectively taking care of ourselves on the one hand, but taking care of the world and what it wants from us on the other. Pluto is in Capricorn, and the moon will be 6 degrees away from Pluto when the full moon is exact. That is close enough to be what's called conjunct, which means the planet of death and rebirth is putting his 2 cents into that which we are looking to let go of right now. So on a personal level, if you listen to this podcast, you're probably looking to your full moon moments to identify what's ready to be dropped and released and let go of. trust and know that we're being supported to change and transform that which we want to be free of on our sort of inner landscape with the power of the planet that brought death into our consciousness in the first place. That alone is going to do two things. One is, on an energetic level, it's going to make this full moon a very intense passage, just in the way that full moons amplify everything. So with the full moon on the sort of hump day of Wednesday in the middle of this week, guarantees that the week is just more energetically intense, because full moons do that. Because the sun's in Cancer, I think there'll be a lot of vulnerability associated with the intense amplification of energy. But from the perspective where we use this energy to allow for change to take place, you better mean it when you say, I'm ready to let go of this, that, or the other thing, because Pluto means business. Death and rebirth is part of this full moon, and enormous amounts of change can take place as we move through this lunar cycle. If you remember, the new moon in Cancer that kicked off this lunar cycle had Black Moon Lilith as part of the lunation, which means we are, all of us, in this lunar cycle, sort of dropping into the inner sanctums of our hearts and seeing where we are, sort of enraged at all the things that need to change sort of out there in the world. And this is a beautiful moment to turn that focus of what needs to be changed on your inner landscape and allow for that Black Moon Lilith fullness of a willingness to get into the dirty aspects of shadow energy and allow for the changes and transformations to take place that are possible. Chiron, the healer, and Black Moon Lilith are forming a square as part of this full moon. So our shadow places where we are really ready to sort of open up the manhole cover and face the stuff that's in the little sewer system of our conscious that's very close to the surface of our conscious awareness. That's Black Moon, right? So we're opening up the doorway to the below. And then Chiron, the healing presence, forming this friction of the square geometry, then allows for healing releases to take place. Though I suspect that this energy might make the passage through this week deeply emotional, deeply vulnerable, and powerfully transformative on an emotional level. So the feels are going to be up. I just want everybody who's listening to trust that though there might be heightened vulnerability, sensitivity, and tenderness of feeling, remember that we're actively healing things that we've been working on all year. So whatever narratives you have, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm sure you know what it is you're looking to free yourself of in terms of the inner life challenges that are still holding you back. Trust that this full moon helps you identify and process that which needs to be let go of right now, that honors your own sense of care for self, but that also prepares you to climb up that mountain of ambitions, goals, and create magnificent things as we move forward out of this lunar cycle and into the year ahead. There's an interesting guidance mechanism that hits later in the week. It's actually over the weekend on Saturday. We're moving through what's called the superior conjunction of Mercury and the Sun. Mercury is never far away from the Sun. He moves too fast. He's too close to the Sun from our perspective for him to actually move further than 18 degrees in either direction of the Sun. This actually is a beautiful, elegant reflection of the distinction between our conscious awareness and our thinking, which seem like they're the same thing, but they're not. Our conscious awareness is sort of something that just is. It exists. It burns as brightly within each of us as awareness as the sun burns brightly in the center of our solar system. It's the same idea. The burning light that is the sun is also us. But our thinking that we think is us is really just an added narrator who speaks about the sun's shining. You can't know your sunshine. You just are it. It's
Oh,
your
okay.
thinking that tells you who you are.
Huh.
When you're asleep and that thinking mind is asleep, and since we talk about dreams on this podcast, it's a perfect example that when we are just in that connectedness, the sun may be down, but we're still our sun. We are still the I am Zoe or the I am Michael, right? The sun has just gone down.
Mm.
When we wake up, what's actually happening is the mind is firing into existence. Like the mind, the brain crackles into conscious awareness as we wake up.
Hmm.
That's Mercury. Mercury starts to think again. And suddenly it's like what I like to talk about. The difference between the sun and Mercury is the sun just is, but it's Mercury how we relate to who I am, where I am, and when I am.
Hmm.
The who, when, and where is the Mercury part, and the I am part of that sentence is the sun.
Okay.
So you see, they work together to create our self-awareness, but they're not the same thing. So when in the cosmos, the sun and Mercury come together by conjunction and align up, it's important for us because it's a moment when our awareness and our thinking are in the same place. And since this is a place where we get screwed up, like people really think they are their thoughts, but we're not our thoughts. We are our isness, and then our thoughts are secondary, designed to help us navigate and narrate the experience. And someone stepping on the spiritual path, one of the most important aspects of being on that path is disciplining the mind, learning how to control not the first thought, but the second, third, and fourth, and fifth thoughts. So when Mercury and the sun come together, we get guidance about where to go next. Our conscious awareness gets infused with direct thoughts about who we are, where we are, and when we are, and therefore guidance about how to choose the next chapter. This happens in every Mercury retrograde cycle at the exact midpoint between the beginning and the end of the backward motion, and we call it the inferior conjunction when Mercury's retrograde because Mercury's actually in between us and the sun when he's retrograde. That becomes an important guidance mechanism moment, but because Mercury's moving backwards, we emphasize it greatly because if you're not paying attention during that moment, you might miss the messages that are there because Mercury's traveling backwards. He's in the below. So it's important to point out the inferior conjunction during a Mercury retrograde, well, because it's an important message and you don't want to miss it. You can't really miss it when we're in the superior conjunction, as we are now, where the sun is in between us and Mercury. And so we're in conscious awareness territory, but we're still having an alignment of awareness and thought. And because it's coming on the tail end of a full moon, and we're moving through a week where we're dropping old ideas about ourselves, I love that just a couple of days after the full moon, this guidance mechanism takes place with the sun and Mercury coming together in Cancer. But what's kind of juicy is that when they get together over the weekend, they're actually going to be pointing back to Saturn with the great eliminator angle, which means that part of what we're going to be guided with or guided to over the weekend is ideas about what to do next based on what we've learned from our Saturn experience over the last bunch of weeks and months. Right? That we are letting something go in the middle of the week in the full moon, and then Mercury and the sun are helping identify with even more clarity something that has to be dropped in order for you personally to be more powerful, more effective, and accomplish the goals that you're setting out to achieve.
That feels like a big realization.
I think it can be, and I think for some people the weekend is going to bring that. I'll add to this mix that they're also Mercury and the Sun, that is, trining Neptune while they come together to deliver this guidance data. Neptune is the great spirit planet. A trine between Mercury and Neptune is like a direct dial in to intuitive guidance that comes directly from spirit. So when you put all of this together over the weekend, there's really a very elegant way that as we move through the week, identifying inhibitions and tenderness and sensitivity that really gets in the way of our effectiveness, we marshal in the desire and the willingness to let that shit go and transform how we're operating. And then we move through the weekend, and some people will, in fact, be inspired by new directions because of the setup that the solar system is offering this week to point us in new directions clearly, as long as we're letting go of the things that are inhibiting our effective movement in the world. The last thing to talk about this week happens also over the weekend. On Sunday, Venus is going to change signs. So Venus has been in Gemini for the last little bit, and on Sunday, she moves into Cancer. And how we process our emotions, how we express our love languages, and how we deal with intimacy experiences, shifts and changes in sensation fairly dramatically. I think there's a bigger shift between an air sign and a water sign when Venus is concerned, because Venus in an air sign has a kind of, well, a mental and intellectual relationship with our feelings. And I think sometimes that is a beneficial couple of weeks. You know,
Right.
3.5 weeks is how long Venus stays in a sign. And for the last 3.5 weeks, she's been in very mental, Mercury-ruled sign of Gemini. And the value of that is that it allows for a passage where we can speak about our emotional experience and actually kind of like nail it, as opposed to sort of using thought to alienate yourself from your own emotional experience. Like sometimes we get too thought-driven and too heady trying to describe our feelings, and we get a disconnect from our feelings by getting too much in our heads about it. But when Venus is in Gemini, that's actually the natural thing to do. So on Sunday, we have a dramatic shift where Venus drops into the watery, tender sign of Cancer. And suddenly we go from chatty, connecting, verbal drive for our intimacy experience and into something much more tender and vulnerable, where we will retreat more when the emotional stakes get a little higher. Cancer is absolutely the most emotionally tender sign because it's the first water sign. So it relates to the water in our bodies, right? Cancer is water in the body. Scorpio is water in like the weather systems, and Pisces is the water of the oceans, right? Because with each sign we evolve. And so Cancer, being the first water sign, is all about how we process our feelings very directly. In fact, Cancer is the sign ruled by the moon, because the moon and tides and water and moods and the monthly cycle are all about it. So Venus moving into Cancer for the next 3.5 weeks means that all of our emotional responses are going to be more tender. Be aware of that. Be gentle with yourselves once that shift occurs. And know that the love language with the Venus in Cancer is absolutely providing care, generating safe spaces for self and other, and the richness of what can happen when we are comfortable enough in ourselves to create intimate spaces within our own hearts and be able to share those intimate spaces with others is highlighted and heightened with Venus in Cancer as well. It's an intense week in an intense month, made even more so by the promise of a full moon that's going to knock your socks off. And understand that the weekend is going to bring us a lot of shifts and changes. Look for the guidance that might come on Saturday. And use Sunday and Monday just to tap into how differently you feel in your emotional body when Venus drops out of the mind and into our feeling spaces a little bit more on Sunday and Monday. And have at it, kids.
It's dream segment time. Every week, Dr. Michael will interpret dreams that are sent in via email or take a live caller. If you would like your dream interpreted on the podcast, you can go ahead and email us at dreams@michaellennox.com. Hopefully your dream will make it onto the show. This week in dreams, we have a couple short ones from Jags. So both of these are recurring dreams, very vivid recurring dreams that they had growing up in their teens. The first one is, one dream was me climbing up the stairs in a very tall old building. And as I climb the stairs, I become more and more afraid until I get to the attic. I am so terrified that I cannot open the door to the attic. I cannot go any further, and I just want to run away. I wake up with this feeling of fear. The other dream was very bizarre. In this dream, everything that I touch shrinks so that it fits into the palm of my hand. I would love an interpretation if that is possible. I love all of your work. Thank you. Jags.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I'm absolutely clear. These are recurring dreams from Jags' teenage life.
Yes.
And Jags is not a teenager now. Okay.
Correct.
I'm going to start with the second dream first, right? Because it reminds me of a dream that I had at like 2 or 3 years old that sort of blew my little mind that I never forgot, which was this experience of being sort of in my landscape, where my body is, and then having a simultaneous sort of experience of things that were much, much, much bigger than me and much, 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 much smaller than me. But when I say bigger and smaller, I don't mean like a tall person and a dog. I mean like a universe and a molecule.
Interesting.
It was a terrifying feeling. It was not a yummy feeling. Now, not only did I, as an adult, devoting my life into looking at dreams and dream interpretation, sort of come to understand this as a fundamental existential dream. I was dreaming about existence.
Mm-hmm.
I was dreaming about the idea that when we are in our three-dimensional world, that there's this enormity above us and this minuscule sensibility below us. And if you think about that, it's terrifying. So there's something about this dream that reminds me of that existential thinking, where everything shrinks to fit into Jags's hand, is, I think, expressing something fundamental about existence. That though things are enormous and small at the same time, that we can actually hold our consciousness in the palm of our hand, even though on a certain level, that's a terrifying thing. Does what she wrote make it sound like this second dream that she's describing was also terrifying?
They just say that it was very bizarre. So I'm not sure if it was bizarre scary or bizarre super weird.
Got it. Okay. Well, for sure for me, whether it was terrifying or not, the second dream is an existential dream of, I think, Jags's psyche sort of showing her, reminding her and showing her that everything is manageable. That life itself is actually something that fits in the palm of our hand, even though we get overwhelmed and we feel not up to the task of the enormity of this, demand that's made on us to enter a body and live a life. That the idea of shrinking things to fit in the palm of our hand is about some measure of control within a universe that offers no real control. that then the experiences of life that are in fact overwhelming ultimately can be shrunk to fit inside the palm of your hand. Like I can feel them, I can hold them, I can appreciate them, I can know them by looking at the palm of my hands, and everything is in there. So it's kind of like a skill set dream, if you will. It's like, hey, Jags, remember this. No problem is bigger than you think it is, or no challenge can actually be greater than that which you can handle. And quite literally handle. What's that old trope that I think sometimes people hate? God never gives you anything that you can't handle. And I am actually inclined to believe that, though I think it's an obnoxious statement. I believe that it is so, that we only are given in any given moment that which we are ready to handle. And I think this dream is that message, that everything that will come along will ultimately be something that Jags can handle because it will shrink to fit into the palm of her hand. So I actually see these dreams working very much in tandem, but I wanted to start with the second dream because to me, this second dream sort of says, don't worry so much about it, Jags. You got this. Because the first dream is really just another existential dream about how terrifying it is to actually grow in wisdom. That our journey through life is to get wiser, smarter, more self-aware. And just like we talked about Capricorn earlier in the astrology section, and with a mountain that the goat is climbing is akin to climbing to higher levels of awareness for greater vantage point. Climbing the stairs of an old tall building is similar. It's like saying if the consciousness that I'm charged with understanding in my life and in my body can be thought of as a symbolic building, my job is to climb to the highest level possible. So the attic in any sort of building symbology, the attic is where our thinking is sort of stored. Memories are in the attic. But I want to emphasize the idea of the higher you go, the higher you climb, is concomitant with becoming more aware. And then the attic would be like the highest you can go. You can't go any higher than the attic because that's the end of the structure.
It's like the end of the road.
Yes, the end of the road. You can't explore more once we've gotten to the attic. So one could think of as the climbing stairs as life process itself, that climbing to the top of the life, you get to the attic and it's a representative of death, that when we move through that attic door, then we're going to connect to the divine mind at the very top of our expression, but that our life in a body is over. So that's one way of looking at the terror of getting up to that door, is that if you look at this dream as a life cycle dream, saying you're going to start your life in a body at the bottom of the stairs, you're going to climb up as high as you get. When you get to the attic, you're done, you die, you move through that door and you join the higher level of consciousness that you were always a part of. You split off from for a moment to go into a body. You get to the attic, you're done. Death is the terror of this dream. But at the same time, I could also just liken the dream and the climb to self-exploration. The idea that I've got to learn more about who I am through a life, and that process alone is scary. It is scary to look at what you're thinking and how your thought patterns are formed, in crucibles of early life that you're then stuck with. So teenage years are also kind of, you're not quite in the freedom of your adult life, so you're well protected, as long as the household you live in is a protective household and, primary caregivers are not, destroying you with trauma. The teenage years are like the last little bits of safety before you climb up to the part of your life where you're no longer contained by the family of origin. And that can be another sort of fearful, what's at the attic door, the end of childhood and into adult responsibility. My favorite interpretation of the dream, though, is that it's about life itself, that the bottom of the stairs is the beginning of life, the top of the climb is the end of life, and that terror at the door is a terror of our mortality. And it's a beautiful dream to sort of help Jags on a deeply unconscious level move through a life where death is an inevitability, but that we want to climb as high as we can, even though we're gonna die at the end.
Thank you for listening to Conscious Embodiment, Astrology and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. You can find us on Apple Music, the iHeartRadio app, and anywhere you find your favorite shows. Head on over to michaellennox.com for information on astrology readings, the Daily Astro Alert subscription, upcoming classes, and to join the mailing list.